Good evening and welcome to the TNT show. My name is John Drummond and I'm your host for the next 60 minutes. And this is going to be 60 minutes of your life, which will be very richly rewarded. You'll hear some stuff tonight that you wish you'd heard before, and lots of ideas for looking at perhaps a new way of looking at independence. And we could all use that right now, because I think it'd be fair to say that most of us feel that the whole independence discussion has become somewhat stale. We've got a situation, for example, which could be in almost no greater contrast between what's happening here and what's happening in the United States, where they're going through some hugely radical changes, most of which are undesirable, but nonetheless, they're significant constitutional changes. Here, we have somehow gotten ourselves into a position whereby constitutional change is terribly important, but not actually happening. Very odd, Hopefully we'll get some answers as to why we have this sort of hiatus or status right now. Our guest tonight, and this, by the way, this is show 203. That's right, we've done 202 shows before. And as you know, we've featured philosophers, we've featured academics, we've featured comedians, we've featured artists, we've featured folks who are starting up businesses in the islands and highlands, and we've talked to just about the full gamut, the full range of Scottish opinion. The only group that we haven't talked to in any great detail, and I would implore, I would beseech, I beg you, if you can put us in touch with one unionist who's prepared to come on the show, and we don't bite, that, come on the show and tell us why unionism, being united, is a good thing, right? And one of the reasons, additional reasons, that I beseech you to put us in touch with someone, or put someone in touch with us, is that roughly 10% of our viewership is unionist. So you would think, under these circumstances, hearing something that you don't want to hear, you might want to register your opinion and say, hey, John Drummond and his guest last night were absolutely raving on about independence. It's all nonsense, and here's why. Come on the show and tell us. I'm reminded, by the way, I was once in Vegas just after the show had started. I think we'd only done about 10, 15 episodes, and I was in the line to immigration, waiting to show them my passport. And this guy tapped me on the shoulder, and he said, John Drummond? I said, yeah. I didn't know from Adam. And he said, I watch your show. I enjoy it. I don't agree with any of it, by the way, but I enjoy the show. And I thought, terrific. I wish I had the presence of mind to say to him, whatever you believe in, why don't you come on the show and tell us about it? A lost opportunity. But maybe through you, we can find a very precious unionist who's prepared to come on the show. We've had people who flirted with the notion that maybe they're in between unionism and independence. Kenny Farquharson comes to mind. Maybe a journalist who's eloquent in the public prints would like to come on and tell us why they believe that independence is very, very inappropriate and unhelpful. But it would be lovely to have one on the show. Anyway, I'll leave that thought with you. So without any further ado, I would like to tell you about our guest tonight, and this is a particular pleasure. David Henry is joining us. Now, David is the director of SSRG, and that's a big and important thing that's happening right now, and he'll be able to tell us more about that in a second or so. But he's also got some other very fascinating news to share with you, particularly if you're one of those people like me who thinks that BBC Scotland, and particularly BBC Scotland News, is a dreadful rip-off, and they're spending 300 million of taxpayers' money producing that amount of output, and most of it, frankly, is not output that most of us in the media would be the slightest bit proud of, frankly, But as we've often said in this show, if you've got first-rate people, they hire first-rate people. Second-rate people hire third-rate people. And then we get to BBC Scotland, where third-rate people hire fourth-rate people. And that's where we are just now. So maybe you'll learn something tonight that looks to change all of that with your help. So without any further ado, let's talk to David Henry, Director of SSRG. Welcome, David. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Just about recovered.
So tell us about SSRG. You've recently had the conference. What are the main talking points, would you say?
Well, SSRG is 5 years old now. It was set up by Dr. Mark McNaught, which I think you've had on your show once before.
Yes.
And myself. And we had two other directors. In fact, we had three other directors. So there's three of us at the moment, and there may be more about to join us. So the purpose of the conference, we did one in 2022, which was a huge success, very similar to what just happened. And huge buzz, as anyone who's ever been to one of these things will realize it takes a lot of organizing. There's a lot of moving parts to get all those people up on those stages and joining us. And this was no exception. So we touched on a number of major subjects: pensions and social security, energy policy. And then, of course, we had the main event on Saturday afternoon for 2 hours. We had the decolonization and self-determination session, which, of course, has now spread worldwide and had quite a lot of coverage of all newspapers, believe it or not, the National. So I'm very pleased that the National has covered it. I was very surprised to see they gave it the front cover and a huge headline, and I wasn't expecting that. And that was a bit of a shock. And I thought, oh, good. Well, the word is out. And they've since covered it 2 or 3 more times. There seems to be lots of activity, lots of people writing letters and opinions flying around, which is great. That's exactly what we were trying to do: provoke conversation and get people around the table and to ask big, important questions. So we had some great panelists. I mean, we had one on the energy policy, and we had Phil Boswell, and I think it was Rhys Stanwicks, both of which actually work in the energy sector, which is a novel approach, I think, for getting experts' opinion, is actually get people that actually have experience of the subject you're talking about. So that was pretty amazing. We also had Jim Sillars and Dr. Elliot Bulmer. They were on a session about what happens the day after independence, i.e. what happens next, what's the most important stepping stones after you've actually voted. And of course, one of the main one was a policy with England on trade, because they're our biggest trading partner at the moment. And of course, that's hugely important. So it was very well received. We've had, do you know what was really did surprise me? Is obviously we were streaming it live on YouTube. We knew there was some very important international guests watching, so that added extra pressure to make sure it was working. But we had a Twitter message from Jakarta, Indonesia, a Scotsman who had been watching it, and he sent us a picture of a Scottish woman. I think her name was Evelyn Stewart Walker, from 1955, this little Scottish woman who stood up at a conference in 1955 and demanded Indonesia be listed for decolonization. Obviously, it was run by the Dutch. And of course, that it turned out to be the first country that did get decolonized, and it was the first country to go through this United Nations C-24 committee. So not only did this blow my mind that somebody in Indonesia had been watching live, but that they had this little nugget of information that I had never heard of. So I've communicated with him and thanked him very much for that. And we've had lots of messages like that. I've had grown men send messages saying they were standing up in somewhere in the Highlands and Islands with tears in their eyes listening to it and thanking us so much for putting it on. And you can't really get much better feedback than that. So I'm very pleased it went well. I'm very pleased it's been well received. So yeah, SSRG's conference, obviously people are asking, are we going to do another one? Probably next year. Yes, I think we are. I didn't want to think of it straight away because I've only just recovered from the last one. But so yeah, SSRG's conference, what can I say? It's been well received.
Excellent. That's very good news. And what's next?
We've already agreed that we're going to take all the speeches that were done in the decolonisation session and turn it into a document. So highlight all the speeches, not only Professor Robert Black, but also Professor Alf Baird, the legal opinion from Geneva, Craig Murray's input, obviously his experience with the United Nations, quite interesting. So there's going to be a detailed coloured document produced. It'll probably be about 20 to 30 pages, which will detail the process, detail what everybody had said, and what the next stages are. So that'll go to print in about a month's time. And the next thing after that, we've agreed with Sarah Sawyers that we should help do a roadshow around Scotland and present the main speeches and have a little pocket version of the decolonisation and self-determination process, so that people can educate themselves and also tell their neighbours and friends and get the word out. So that's what the next two things from SSRG are going to be.
Excellent. Let's talk a little bit about Professor Robert Black, because he's made a bit of a stir. Because as I understand it, Robert Black's view, a changed view, I gather, i.e. that he once believed this wasn't the case, but he now believes it is the case, that in fact the Act of Union was not as marked on the label. In other words, it did not produce a United Kingdom. It produced a continuation of England, just with a new name. It was then retitled United Kingdom, but the reality was it continued as England. Do you want to tell us more about his remarks?
Yes, well, I'd never met Robert Black, KC, before Saturday. And what day was that? The 17th. And Saturday the 17th between 2 and 4 p.m, I think actually is going to turn out to be historically important. So people can go on and watch it. It's on the SSRG TV YouTube channel. The whole thing's there, so they can go and watch it for themselves. Make up their own mind what they think. I think the thing what struck me was the point that he claimed that the day after, and I'm dealing with a legal case at the moment to do with broadcasting, which we might touch on later, but so I'm used to dealing with legislation and looking at the fine detail and the rules and regulations, etc. But when I heard him refer to what happened the day after the union was apparently created, that for England nothing changed, and also he stated that all the speaker didn't change. There was no elections of new people for this new state. It was all the same people that had been running the English Parliament the day before. But the key fact that I thought no one can argue with this is the next piece of legislation that was passed was the next number to be used from the English Parliament. And yet at this time, the Scottish Parliament had been extinguished. That tells me that there was no union. It was a continuation of the English Parliament. It was a continuation. And in fact, they went further than that. He said that Scots law, civil law, the highest court, then became the highest court in England. So Scots law didn't continue exactly as before. It did get changed, yet nothing changed in England. So I think when you look at what he states and how clearly he puts it, I mean, my understanding is, and he said this in his speech, for 59 years out of the over 60 years that he's been practicing law as a part-time judge, head of the legal process at the Edinburgh University, he believed in this fantasy that the United Kingdom was created in 1707. And it was only after being asked to look at it, and I believe he was quite negative towards this whole idea, until he went away and researched what actually took place between 1706, the Treaty of Union, which it was between England and Scotland, and then the 1707 Acts of Union, one in Scotland and one in England. And of course, when you look at what actually happened, the English Parliament continued unchanged with the same people in the same jobs, and the Scottish Parliament was extinguished and was dissolved. So that is not a union, that is a takeover. Now that poses huge questions. Now, have we been living in a 300-year-old fantasy? If we have, which it looks like we have, then what happens to all the treaties that the United Kingdom has entered with other territories for 300 years? Are they all null and void because it's built on a legal fiction? Because in contract law, if you or I pretended to be somebody else and entered a contract with somewhere else, and it turned out that we were actually fraudulent, then that contract is null and void. That is the same in international trade agreements. You can't stand there saying you're one thing, signing agreement, even joining the EU for that matter, and then you find out later that they're not what they say they are, and they're not that party. So this has huge ramifications. My understanding is that the case is now going to be taken to the United Nations, the C24 committee, the exact same one that in 1955 accepted Indonesia and decolonized them, along with lots of other countries that have gone. So I think the future for Scotland's independence isn't going to go the way the politicians thought it was going to go. I think it's going to be taken out of their hands and put into the international arena. So if SSRG's conference has done anything, it's helped raise what is an enormously significant question. And I think that's where it's going to go. And it'll be interesting to see what the politicians, how long it takes them to wake up and realize the world has changed. It's now out there. And I believe it's the first stage is in June. So it's not long, it's not far away. It's only a matter of weeks before we'll start getting an indication from the UN C24 committee. I believe the process is fairly clear how that will be done. So I think if that's what's going to come, then the politicians have got a lot of catching up to do, and most of them didn't believe this was possible, haven't been paying attention. There's very few that I think have been listening. Well, they have to listen now.
Interesting, because you say that politicians haven't been listening. Were any politicians represented at the SSRG conference?
Yeah. Well, we invited all 129 MSPs. Mm-hmm. The vast majority we got automated, and this was on the 1st of April. I don't even remember doing this, to be honest. I discussed it with Mark. I asked him, did you do this? Did you send the invite? He went, no, you did it. Did I? I don't remember this. And that's how stressful the last few weeks have been. So on the 1st of April, in the subject, it said, this is not an April Fool joke. So I put that in there because I realized we were sending it out the 1st of April. So we've sent it to all 129 MSPs. We did get a reply from Kate Forbes on the 23rd of April saying her diary conflicts means she wouldn't be able to attend. No one else sent us anything. So only one person actually sent us an acknowledgement. All the rest were automated. Thanks for getting in touch, etc., etc.
What do you think?
So I don't.
Well, I mean, this is a time we've got a by-election happening just now. Politicians generally have an appetite for grubbing for votes wherever these votes might be possible, and yet here we have a situation where they had an opportunity to talk to people on a platform that was being provided by somebody else. You weren't being, I assume, restrictive about what they could say, so they were free to say what they had to say.
Yep.
And yet none of them took up the invitation to talk about the constitutional future.
Yeah. Well, we did have, to be fair, we had a couple of panelists. So we had Neil Hanvey, obviously the deputy leader of ALBA. We had Colette Walker, who's the leader of ISP. They were all there. We also had the ex-SNP MP Douglas Chapman. He was also on a panel, which was most enlightening. It's a shame. I think he's left politics. I think I think he's a huge loss. Yeah, I think it's in. Listen, the way I look at this, and I've been thinking about this, what was going to be announced at that session, because I obviously I was privy to the general tone of what was going to be said, and it then dawned on me what an enormous change this is. It is earth. It's groundbreaking. It's earth-shattering. It completely turns the idea of our history of the UK for the last 300 years upside down. Because indeed, Professor Robert Black, who is KC, who's got lots of letters after his name. He's very distinguished. If he's correct, he's come to this not because he wanted to, in fact, almost against his better judgment and what he believed. And he's come up with this legal opinion based on what actually took place. And you can't really argue with the logic when he's displayed it. If he's correct, then it means the Scottish Parliament is an empty building. It doesn't exist when it comes to parliaments because it's a piece of paper from Westminster. It's the 1998 Scotland Act. Yes, well, that's blank because if it's a legal fallacy that the UK even existed for 300 years, then every piece of paper they've written in 300 years is a blank piece of paper because it's not real. It's because the institution isn't real.
Well,
now, if that's the case,
let's examine that just for a second,
yeah.
David. My understanding, and granted I wasn't there, I listened to the recording of what Robert Black said. My understanding of what he said was England continued unchanged. Scotland was extinguished. Its parliament had gone and it was subsumed, i.e. a number of MPs traipsed south and along with some lords. But everything else continued the same. There was no elections, there was no referendum, there was no vote of any kind apart from the ones that took place that we know about. And the Speaker of the House of Commons continued in the same post.
Correct.
In fact, I think he's quoted as saying, now we have catched Scotland and we will keep her. So it doesn't sound as if he was impartial on this.
Doesn't sound like a union, does it? Sounds more like a takeover.
Exactly. Now, there being such a thing as a takeover, so, and I think Robert Black alluded to this, that maybe the best way to look at this situation is not a union, but a corporate takeover, where one company, the bigger of the two, took over the other one. And essentially what happens then in most cases is that that it's not a merger, it's just literally a takeover. But then all that happened really was England then became renamed as the United Kingdom. So that people who were striking deals with England with the United Kingdom, knew they were striking deals with England. They didn't, I suspect, believe that they were striking deals with Scotland in any way, shape, or form. And they probably wouldn't have wanted to, I would imagine. So it seems to me that change of title wouldn't necessarily abrogate any of those treaties, would it?
Well, it would, because what they're presenting, if they were offering a trade deal with just England and Scotland tagged on as an extra, and they made that clear to their other party that they were entering this trade agreement with, then it wouldn't be an issue. But that's not what they've told the international world. And it's not what they've told the EU when they were negotiating to join it and to leave it. They've said it was the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom, which included the two kingdoms, Kingdom of Scotland and the Kingdom of England. And therefore, if Professor Black is correct, then that they have misrepresented themselves. So these agreements are null and void. And I come back to, if you wanted a better demonstration of colonialism, just go back to thinking about Theresa May when she was asked for the Section 30. Now is not the time. Oh, really? Is that true? So, and I think that was reinforced. And I actually got a small smile when I read the legal opinion from the Supreme Court, which stupidly Nicola Sturgeon decided to take to the Supreme Court and ask that question. And of course, the answer that she got back wasn't so helpful. And of course, it basically said that it's up to Westminster. Westminster Parliament is sovereign and it's up to them. Well, that's not how it works. And saying you need our permission if you want to leave this union doesn't sound like a union at all. It sounds like you've been captured. And that is exactly the sort, and now is not the time. Yes, that's what colonialists do. They don't want you to leave. So I think there's plenty of evidence to show how they've operated, that this is colonialism. Scotland is a colony controlled from England. and the fact that we can't even hold a referendum without their permission sort of underlines that is the case. So I believe it's really changed people's point of view when it comes to independence. This isn't about going back and acting for a Section 30, which they've already refused, I think, 3 times. That's all very helpful evidence to go in front of the United Nations. So I think the way forward is totally different. I think the politicians are being caught off guard, and they're going to have.
Most people in England would not be surprised by what you just said, because for most of them, Scotland is a bit like Yorkshire. I mean, they view it as somewhat...
Only with more fresh water.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. In fact, my boss, when I was at Midland Bank, the deputy group chief executive, a nice man called Goldthorpe, who was from Yorkshire, once said to me, "You know the difference between a Scotsman and a Yorkshireman, John?" I said, "No, I don't." He said, "Well, a Yorkshireman is a Scotsman with all of his natural generosity squeezed out." It was his way of saying, I like you, I like what you do, but effectively we're all one the same here." And I think a lot of people south of the border would probably implicitly take that view, that Scotland is a bit like a slightly more exotic form of Yorkshire. Now, why should the United Nations or anyone else agree to Yorkshire leaving England? Makes no sense.
Yeah, but Yorkshire hasn't. Yorkshire has MPs. It's not a separate country. It's not a separate territory. So the analogy doesn't really work. It falls apart almost immediately. And the Scottish people's culture, etc.
Scotland has its MPs. Yorkshire has its own territory. I mean, people know what Yorkshire is. They know geographically what Yorkshire is. Same way they know what geographically.
But it's not a country. Well, it's never been a country.
Who can claim Scotland's a country? I mean, what you then get into the business.
Well, we were first identified as a nation in, I think it was 1859. So it goes way back, well, long before the Union was created. So no, Scotland's been known as a culture, a completely separate culture. When the Romans.
I understand that.
Yeah.
This is not just devil's advocate stuff. I think there's an essential point here somewhere, which is that Scotland voluntarily gave up its status as a country to become effectively like Yorkshire. And now this is how the outside world might view it. And now it's complaining because it made that error back in 1707. Well, I'm sorry. You've had loads of time to address this. You haven't bothered. And now you're coming to us as the international community saying you don't like it anymore. Well, if we get somebody from Yorkshire turning up, we'll have to, whatever answer we give to you, we have to give to them, surely.
Listen, there's been 63 countries, I think, leave and end British rule. They leave British rule because the British are not very good at running an economy, because every country they've ever been involved in actually got poorer. And in the end, certainly after the Second World War, Britain couldn't afford to fund its British Empire anymore, and that's why most of them were allowed to leave. So there's a reason why people don't want to be run from London for the benefit of London and the southeast. When it comes to a hypothetical, if Yorkshire wants to break away from England and have its own law and its own parliament, well, let them do that. Every nation is allowed to do that. When it comes to Scotland, Scotland's got its own natural resources, got its own culture. When the Romans came and invaded what was the UK back then, they stopped at Hadrian's Wall and never actually ruled Scotland. So clearly there's been a difference for hundreds of years, centuries. So I think Scotland is naturally more of a northern Scandinavian type country, the way it thinks. It's more socialist. We don't seem to be so xenophobic and be worried about foreigners. We voted 62% in the referendum to stay in the EU, while I'm afraid our neighbours in England, a majority of them voted to leave. And no one can claim that it's been a success, because it's not.
This is where you get to an interesting point. Scotland, think about this. Your assertion is that Scotland is a separate country. And there was this dodgy deal done in 1707 But then that dodgy deal was looked at again during the referendum for Europe. And Scotland said, we need to give our consent to this. Scotland never did give its consent, but things carried on as before. I mean, that pretty much endorses Professor Robert Black's point, which is that for all effective purposes, Scotland is treated no differently to Yorkshire. In other words, if Yorkshire had said, if we voted differently, we want to be treated differently, that would have been ignored as well, in much the same way. The Scottish politicians, for good or ill, and mostly ill, many would argue, decided, hey, we'll put up with this. In other words, they didn't raise a major objection at the end of the day, and therefore Scotland left the EU. That would have been the time, I suspect, that if one had a specific view on these things, there was a major constitutional change which Scots didn't agree with, and yet they went ahead with it. And the Scots agreed to it. And their politicians agreed to it.
Yeah, the last 10 years have shown that poll after poll, and it's now fairly consistent, the majority of people living in Scotland, so that's not the majority of Scots, it's a clear majority of Scots, want Scotland to be independent. Now, there's a difference of opinion on what sort of agreement it should go into with Europe. The SNP talks about rejoining the EU, which there's two major issues that they seem to ignore. One is they've not got a currency policy that makes any sense and therefore precludes you from even applying if you don't control your own currency. So they haven't addressed that failing. And then the second thing that they've been pushing is these free ports, which would also prevent you from joining the EU because they're regulatory and financial black holes. So, and you're not allowed to have that. It's unfair competition within the EU single market. So there is, I have to say, I think our Scottish politicians are left wanting. They do not seem to have a grasp. I see few talking sensible policies or even trying to progress the argument for independence in the last 10 years. Very few of them have. So I think what's changed is people, and I think that's what's happened at SSRG's conference. It's created a spark. People are no longer interested in what these politicians are saying because they're not actually listening to what the people want. And if the polling is correct, and it's well over 50% of the polling wants Scotland to be independent and would vote yes if you gave them a vote. You have to look at the reason why that is. Brexit's made Britain a more unequal country. It's damaged the economy. Things are not getting better, they're getting worse. And you're right, it was a constitutional question that was created in 2016 when Scotland voted 62% Remain and England voted 50-something% Leave. And because there's more of them, that carries more weight than what should have probably happened is all four nations, Wales, including Gibraltar, etc., should have all had to vote the same way for it to be legitimate. And yet that was not considered important. And what you therefore had is Gibraltar 98% voting Remain, Northern Ireland over 50% voting Remain, 62% Scotland voting Remain. It was England and Wales who voted Leave, and that's the rest of the UK gets dragged out with them. And so, yes, it raises a constitutional question. It also, I think, shows that there is a different culture, both politically and on policy. And you cannot keep people prisoner in a bigger vessel. Countries break up all the time. They've done it all over Europe. You know, when they were all in the Eastern Bloc and the Eastern and Soviet Union, it collapsed, and then they all started to go their own separate ways. You know, if the Czech Republic can have a velvet revolution and they can split because they want to run their own country, then and they're the same landmass, then there is absolutely no reason why Scotland can't become an independent country with its own currency and its own trade arrangement with Europe. And perhaps it will actually benefit England to have a successful, energy-rich country on its border, because I think England is fragmented. So you talk about Yorkshire, you go a bit further north. They don't get much inward investment from the English system. You go down to London and the southeast, and it's overflowing. with money and revenue. And so there are huge differences in England. So, and Scotland, of course, you're quite right, it is treated as an extra region of England. It's Northern England, as far as many people are concerned. Well, let's let the people decide. And decolonisation is a legitimate process. Everyone will be involved in the new country as it's being created. Well, my goodness, we can do a better job than what we're in at the moment, if you ask me.
It's going to be fascinating. Is there any intention to take Robert Black's remarks and include those in the package of materials that you've been making available?
Yes, no, we're taking our next two things that we're doing in SSRG is we sat and thought about it. These speeches were momentous. The PowerPoint that was used by Professor Alf it was very useful. The mindset, the colonial mindset being reinforced by the BBC, of course, every night, being forced to pay for it as well. So absolutely all of that is fascinating stuff and lots of detail. So we're taking all of those speeches, and I think there was 4 or 5 of them, including Professor Robert Black Casey's final speech, and using that as the basis of here's the process with the United Nations, here's what this would mean. So there will be a substantial document being sent to the printers in about a month's time from SSRG. Then we're doing a small roadshow around Scotland with a smaller version of it, a pocket size. I suppose it would be like the wee blue book, but it's based on decolonisation and self-determination and the next steps. So, and that might have to raise some money if we're going to print tens of thousands of them. And then finally, SSRG will be attending the next EFTA seminar, which is in September in Brussels. We've been before. We're also planning to do an exhibition in the European Parliament, where we will be displaying and distributing our decolonisation and self-determination document. So putting Scotland's claim in front of European legislators. So we don't need Scottish politicians. If they're too busy fighting amongst themselves and coming up with the latest whiz of increasing car taxes and minimum pricing for alcohol or the GRR bill Mark II or whatever it is they've decided to spend their time on, rather than the big issue, which is Scotland's constitutional future, then let them do what they like. I suspect many of them will wake up and decide, though there's something to this, and it will be interesting to see which political party decides to use this as their calling card at the next Scottish election, because I think one of them will.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. Of course, we've got a by-election coming up soon.
Yes.
And I gather...
Not next week. I think it's next week.
I gather that, according to the SNP, that Labour voters are deserting Labour, and one of the beneficiaries of that would appear to be reform. And by all accounts, the reform may well come in as runners-up, i.e. the SNP may well have the seat, but in fact that reform will come second. Now, surely that puts your assertion that Scotland is a different sort of place into a very different light indeed, that a far-right party can take second position in a Scottish by-election. How do you explain that?
Well, I've stood in the general election last year. I stood as an independent candidate. Reform came almost nowhere. That was in Edinburgh West. It's a Liberal Democrat seat, the Liberal Democrat safely. They did throw the kitchen sink at it, of course. And I was a very late comer to the process, so just before the deadline. So I've got a bit of experience of actually standing in elections and by-elections, and I've met and seen the teams out for reform. Truth is, they don't really have any policies, and it's a protest vote. I totally understand that people are fed up with UK politics and Scottish politics. Things are not getting better, everything's getting worse. The cost of electricity is sky high, inflation on food, all of these things. People's cost of living is not going well, it's got worse. Brexit didn't help. So I understand that people are looking at this from a protest point of view, But what it actually does is it just splits the unionist vote. So I suspect the unionists are going to have a very hard time gaining any traction because, of course, you're quite right. Reform is going to take votes away from Labour. Labour have got a terrible suite of policies. You know, you don't take money off pensioners and yet give tax breaks to others and invest in renewables and think that people think that's acceptable. And it wasn't in your manifesto. So, of course, I totally understand why Labour voters are completely fed up with what Labour's done. I don't see that that reform in Scotland is really a huge threat. They are going to take votes away from, first of all, they were taking votes away from the Conservatives, but now they seem to be taking votes away from.
You can just imagine what the BBC and others, and particularly the right-wing press, are going to say. They're going to say, look, reform came second, so that completely scotches this notion that Scots are somehow different, they're above the fray, they're not upset about immigration. Clearly they are, otherwise they wouldn't have voted for reform. You can just read the public prints right now. I don't have to say much more than that.
However, the one thing I learned over 10 years that I was involved in politics with the SNP, then Alba, and now an independent. I left Alba just over a year ago. And the lesson I learned a long time ago, actually, is the majority of people pay no attention to politics at all. The majority of people, despite all us that are actively involved and take a keen interest, so we might know what's going on, we might think it's important, but the vast majority of the public pay no attention. And they only know there's an election when their polling card comes through the letterbox telling them there's a vote in a fortnight's time. And I believe that is true, and that's something that was told to me by an elected member of parliament, actually, that was the case. So you can't read too much into why people vote a certain way. People vote for parties, and they do vote generally for parties and not people. Basically, it's because they've always done that. It's very difficult to get people to change their view. I think reform has had a lot of exposure with Nigel Farage. I don't even think it is right-wing politics. I think it's just the politics of hate and point the finger and blame somebody else. And of course, that's populism, and populism tends to work, and it's worked everywhere that it's used. They've also got a lot of money behind them. That's a bit worrying, that there's money coming into politics, and it's not people at the ground level that are donating money, it's people with big checkbooks. That generally doesn't happen in Scotland very much. You know, the SNP tends to get most of its money from its membership and its supporters rather than big checks from corporate donors. So we're not quite like the United States yet. But you can't really say that people are voting for reform in Scotland, for instance, because of immigration, because we don't really have an immigration problem in Scotland. This is very much the south of England, with their point to the English Channel.
I'm not saying that that's what people will think. I think that's what they'll be told to think.
Yeah,
I think when the first editions of the Daily Mail and the Express after the election, they will say reform is gaining big in Scotland.
Yeah.
This notion that Scots are sympathetic to immigrants is all nonsense. And this vote proves it. This is pretty much what they'll say.
Yeah, well, that's you may be right. That's how they spin it. But is it true? Probably not. People vote for all sorts of different reasons, and I know this from knocking doors and delivering tens of thousands of leaflets and campaigning and doing street stalls. And I meet people, and I like meeting people, and I like hearing what they've got to say. Yeah. Even when they don't support your party and they don't support independence and they want to have a go at you, well, go ahead. I'm quite happy to have the conversation and argue the point and argue why I believe it's in the best interest of Scotland. But you're right, that is the way it might be portrayed. However, I think you'll find the main reason people are disgruntled with the Labour Party is because of their terrible policies and got nothing to do with what actually reform is standing for. So, but that's up to them. I'm not involved in political parties anymore. It's the one beauty about having being involved in SSRG, a think tank that's non-partisan, is we are open to everybody. We invited all MSPs to join us, including all the unionists. In fact, I would love them to come and make the case for staying in the union, so I could pick holes in it. But I don't think I think they know that it would be easily to pick holes in it, so they don't want to come and make the case.
Well, maybe so. I mean, let's move on to something else, which is really exciting. Tell us about SBC.
Yeah, well, I set it up 10 years ago. So I registered the trademark SBC, that's short for Scottish Broadcasting Company, 10 years ago. I made approaches to STV in 2018, just before they closed STV2 to try and, because I'd heard that it looked like they were going to close down STV2, which is a chain of local terrestrial transmitters for local TV. There's 5 of them in Scotland. STV had got the licenses for the 5. They had only had it, I think, 9-10 months as a single network. It was doing quite well. It was reaching over 1 million viewers a month in Scotland. And these are public service broadcast licenses. So they're commercial, so you're meant to commercially fund it yourself. But there is a legal requirement for you to produce 1 hour of news, non-repeating in prime time every day. So that's part of the license requirements. Now, that's quite difficult to fund commercially because news doesn't make money. It loses money. All news channels effectively lose money. So you have to fund it somehow. So SBC's business plan, which is now finished and is with potential investors at the moment and is getting well received, shows that we need to raise £5 million. It's a general entertainment channel with news and current affairs. It will absolutely be impartial and balanced. I've given this a lot of thought. How do you structure? And I've never done news. I've done other types of programs, but I've never done news. And I've sat and looked at all for months, been watching the big stories unfold, both in the newspapers, and think, right, how would the new channel cover this? And so there's 3 golden rules that I've written down in the business plan for the news section. So, and in our newsroom, it's going to be on the wall, huge writing on the wall. Rule 1, stick to the facts. Rule 2, confirm the facts. Rule 3, broadcast the facts, no matter what the subject is. There's far too many channels, and this is why I think people don't trust and don't watch mainstream media very much anymore. There's far too much, if you like, not giving the facts, but offering opinions as if they're fact. And it's not balanced to have, and the BBC's terrible at doing this, offering one set of opinions and then having the opposite set of opinions be as so-called balance. Now, they did this during the Brexit debate. You know, to win Brexit, they had a big red bus with a huge lie on it, saying we send 350 million a week to the EU. That was a lie. We've never sent 350 million pounds a week. And yet they allowed that every night on BBC News, on all channels. And what they did is they allowed the other side to counter it. That is not a fact. That's not news. And I think if it wasn't for the BBC, frankly, Britain would never have voted to leave the EU. But it was this false equivalence, this pretense of balance, 2 sets of opinions do not make a fact. There's room for talk TV where people debate things and you're getting opinions, and that's fine, but that's not the news. The best of breed, I happen to think at the moment, is Channel 4 News. They're still quite biased towards London because it comes mainly from London. So there is an English, South of England bias to the undercurrent. However, it is prepared to research and broadcast stories that are against the government of the day, which sometimes get them into trouble. They did it with the Conservatives, and then, of course, the Conservatives threatened to privatise them and sell them off. Thankfully, that hasn't happened. So public service broadcasting is hugely important. So SBC, we're going to raise £5 million using an EIS scheme. So that's a tax-efficient investment scheme for people that pay high taxes. It's tax-free. And the profit that they sell their shares at after 3 years, if that's what they do, is also tax-free. So that's the advantage to investors. It's tax-free and the profit is tax-free. Of course, it's a startup, so there's a risk attached to all startups. However, this channel, I've given this a lot of thought. So here's some of the things that it's going to do that no one else does. All programs will have subtitles in English and Gaelic available. That's not that technically difficult to do now. We're going to use the dual stereo audios that are broadcast. This happens in Europe. You probably get it in, I don't know Portugal very well, but I do know that if you go to France and Germany and you go into the TV and you change the audio to original audio, if it's an American TV series, you'll get it in English, well, and in American. Because I've done this, and you end up, you've got whatever, Charlie's Angels on, or whatever it happens to be, and you change the audio to original, they're broadcasting not only the French dubbed version, but also the original soundtrack that came from the studio. So we're going to do that on SBC.
Don't you, I'd like to come on to your crowdfunding in a second, how people might be able to help you. But isn't that a major stumbling block that you need to convince Ofgem?
Ofcom, yes. Well, don't need to convince them so much. There's already a license holder that has 22 local licenses, all 5 in Scotland. So he's in breach of all of his licenses. I wrote a detailed complaint with evidence showing that they're in breach. They're not providing the 1 hour of required news, and this is a statutory duty. It's in the legislation. You're not allowed not to do it. So I wrote to Ofcom. I gave them all the evidence. That was a year ago in February. Last December, which this is after them telling me they still hadn't made a decision whether to open a complaint. That was in September last year. In December, just before Christmas, they published, I think it was the 16th or 20th of December, they published their decision. They had found him in breach of 14 out of his 20 licenses for the year 2022. So, excellent. They just proved my point. I told you they're in breach. So there's also a legislative renewal process that's just started. So that's why I'm going to court on the 8th of July in London against Ofcom's decisions. And I've asked for an injunction to stop this auto-renewal process for these channels that are in breach of their license. So it's a very detailed case. It's 760 odd pages that I submitted. I have done this before, which is why I found Robert Black's comments very interesting. I did this before in 2010. I took Ofcom and B-Sky B to the same court, Competition Appeal Tribunal, to ask for an interim relief order to be amended. They, of course, objected very strongly. I won and created case law. So I know the rules. I'm very good on detail when it comes to this. And this is an area of law and technology I totally understand. So I'm doing this myself. So it's my own expense. They've obviously all got QCs and lawyers, etc. I expect to win my case, and I expect to then at some point buy these licenses, especially for Scotland. And it'll take us a year before we can launch. It's not going to happen overnight, even if once we've got the licenses. It'll take a year to build the channel. I was down in London for 10 days a few weeks ago at MIP TV meeting Sony Pictures Television. I met the people that own live Scottish football rights. I've met documentary maker libraries, because this is a proper channel with proper programs. A lot of them will be licensed, we'll buy them in, but a growing number will make ourselves or commission ourselves. And I found what Alf Baird said during our conference about colonial mindset and Scottish culture, etc. Now, I speak the way I do because I spent a lot of time in London, and so I've got quite an Anglified accent, which is not a bad thing because it means people can understand what I'm saying when I'm speaking to them in London. However, I don't speak Gaelic, but we're going to give a firm commitment that as many programs as possible are going to be dual language.
So would SBC be funded with commercials, or would it be funded?
No, well, the business, it's a multi-funding model. Okay. So yes, there will be adverts. So there'll be a free-to-air version, which is must carry on Sky, and Virgin, and on the Freeview transmitters. That will be standard definition. But we're also going to launch an HD version via Sky, which is an encrypted version. So it's a pay channel. It's £5 a month. And also that will be offered to pubs. Now that's where we're going to put lots of sport. So you'll press a red button. If people know about digital TV, you can transmit another channel with your main one. It's hiding behind it. So there'll always be sport on when we've got major sport events to show. So the pubs will find it very attractive. So that's one of the revenue streams. The pay subscription model of £5 a month. The question is, can we get 100,000 people to subscribe at £5? I think we can in high definition. We're looking at putting the live sport on the HD channel and having it slightly delayed on the standard definition channel. So it's as live. Now that gives you the incentive to subscribe, because commercial TV, this is advertising and sponsorship, is in a lot of trouble financially. So if we were to base it just on that, it would fail. It would commercially fail. So it's only when you put all of these things together, along with a streaming service with movies, all of our content on it, the live stream will be on it for sport, so you'll be able to get it online as well via an app. You bring that all together, hey presto, after 3 years, it's making a healthy profit and reinvesting in more and more content. If you did it as free to air only, that's a recipe for disaster. So that's why we're not doing that. So it's a multi-revenue platform. The key is putting money into original programming. Most of the stuff at the beginning will be licensing feature films, etc., from Hollywood studios and that. I've already had prices from a couple of studios. There's a lot of television. I mean, people that don't know this, most of the programs that you see on TV channels are not made by that channel, but have been licensed or bought in from the program market. It's a huge market. The one thing I'm really looking forward to, we've got a documentary strand called Eye on the World. It's got a fabulous graphic. And Eye on the World is actually the title that John Logie Baird, the inventor of television, in 1928 used on his televisors. Over the top of it, it said Eye on the World. I love the title.
Super.
So we're going to use that. So it's our version of Panorama. Every week there will be, in fact, one of the program people that I went to see, documentary library salespeople, and they told me that we're having a terrible year. None of the channels want anything to do with Gaza, nothing to do with Israel, nothing controversial, and something else. I can't remember what else it was. And I went, well, I'm the opposite. I want everything that's controversial. I'm very interested in all these big questions, and we want balance. But yes, we're happy to have things that people want to hear about rather than hiding behind. So that's Eye on the World, and it's going to, and we will commission some of our own programs as well for Eye on the World.
David, this sounds fantastic, and hopefully you can come back once you've reached some
I can show you the plan. Look.
Oh, there you are. Look at that. Excellent. So if people want to get, we've almost run out of time, but if people want to support what you're doing, how do they get in touch with you?
Well, for the SBC, this is really simple. I've got a small crowdfunder towards the legal costs. Anyone that puts £20 into it gets a free invitation for the launch party next year. Obviously, there's caveats that this is a high-risk project, etc.
Where do they write to? Do they write to www?
There's a crowdfunder. SBC crowdfunder is online. I can perhaps send a link to Kevin, and he can use that.
Excellent.
But that's available online. You go into crowdfund, you type in SBC or my name, and it should come up. Excellent.
David, this has been fantastic. And I hope you'll come back and talk more about SBC, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk to Robert Black and for that matter some of his critics as well. Let's find out. Let's travel the waterfront, as they say.
Absolutely. Let's get the critics and let's shoot them down one by one.
It's been very good. I just want to say a few words before we close. You've all noticed, folks, that there's been no live interaction tonight. That's on purpose. This is something we're trying, which is very new. which is that David was only available tonight, and we had to grab him when we had a chance to speak to him. And I know you'll feel that that was a decision that was completely justified in light of what you've just seen and heard. But it didn't mean that you weren't able to give us your questions. But however, if David is able to come back and perhaps talk some more about SBC, then you will have an opportunity for that to be interactive. So let me close by saying a big thank you to David, a big thank you to all of you watching this recording, and I leave you with the words that I use every single time, which is look after yourselves, stay safe, and take care. Good night. See you next week at 7 o'clock.